Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's afternoon session. As you are aware, the South African Bar Association hosts a program every Thursdays from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. This program is intended to deal with a legal topic, advocacy-related topic intended to improve the skill set of practitioners and thereby to improve the quality of legal presentation in our courts. Participants are encouraged to ensure that their video cameras and microphones are deactivated during the presentation and to unmute themselves only during the question and answer session. Following the presentations, questions raised during the question and answer session must please be restricted to the topic under discussion. I now go to a brief CV of our esteemed guest. Our esteemed guest for today is Attorney Aslam Moolla. Attorney Aslam Moolla is the founding partner of Moolla Attorneys Incorporated, a law firm that operates throughout South Africa and with international clients. The firm has a particular focus into South African labour law and its practical application and implementations from a macro to individual perspective. Aslam himself holds a master's in law from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He is a practicing attorney, a member of several organizations, and has over a decade of legal experience. Aslam today shall be addressing us on a topic titled Latest Developments Around COVID-19 Mandatory Vaccinations. As you are all aware, this session is recorded and will be made available upon the South African Bar Association website, that being www.rsabar.net. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you, Aslam. Over to you, Aslam.
Hello, Ahmed. Thank you for introducing me, and it's my pleasure to be here as well.
Thank you, Aslam. Thank you for that.
Okay, I'm now going to be sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Please tell me if you can see it.
I am able to see it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So let's get started with it. I've got a very short presentation today, but essentially covering the policy and legal landscape when it comes to mandatory vaccinations in South Africa. As the host has indicated, I do specialize in labor law, and one of the aspects that we're going to be covering today is, should the government make mandatory vaccinations compulsory in the workplace? And more importantly, can an employee be fired for not being vaccinated? Later on, we're going to be looking at some of the recent updates to South African law in respect of that. However, why don't we start off by looking at the international landscape first, in particular, having a look at international policy. The first aspect to look at is the British government, which has come forward and instructed companies to make vaccines compulsory. Also, other countries such as Italy, France, and Greece have introduced mandatory vaccinations for health workers and certain government workers as well. We also look at the United States, where President Joe Biden has announced a plan that will require businesses which employ more than 100 employees to ensure that their staff are fully vaccinated or show a negative COVID test result once a week before coming to work. But what about South Africa? What is the policy in South Africa? Currently, the South African government says that it will not make COVID vaccinations compulsory. You all remember the speech from the president where he indicated that. However, the government has come forward and indicated that they will not stop companies from introducing mandatory vaccinations. What this means is that companies have a right to introduce a mandatory vaccination in the workplace if they feel that it's going to be of beneficial interest to their employees and it's going to create a safe working environment. That covers a brief overview of the international landscape and where South Africa sits from a policy perspective. Now, how does a person prove that they are vaccinated? Obviously, it's through a vaccine certificate, which is made available to confirm a person's vaccination status. This is important to ensure that there is what we call herd level immunity amongst the population. That's what most governments are striving for at this point in time. My question to the audience today is, are vaccines the only way to ensure immunity? Natural immunization occurs when a person recovers from the illness. In other words, when someone's being infected with COVID and they've recovered either through a form of treatment, whether that's being hospitalized or being treated at home, and now they've developed a kind of resistance to COVID naturally. Will that not also count as a level of immunization? These are questions for us to consider. More questions and more important and burning questions are, for instance, the testing of vaccines. That seems to be the #1 issue at this point in time when we get clients and companies saying, should we make it mandatory? How do we know whether the vaccine has been fully, independently, and rigorously tested against control groups? And what are the outcome of these tests? Other vaccines like the polio one, been around for decades. The COVID vaccines, we're only talking about a couple of years here. How do we know the long-term impact of these vaccines? Also, what about the ingredients of these vaccines? Are they toxic to the human body? Do they cause adverse reactions in the long term? These are some of the questions that we need to consider. Now, speaking about adverse reactions, people who are taking the vaccines or have been told to take the vaccines, have they been fully informed of their rights before they've been forced to take the vaccine? For example, some of the vaccines have had adverse reactions. Some have caused blood clotting. What happens in cases like that? Also, are people aware that the vaccine could potentially be a form of experimental mRNA gene-altering therapy? In other words, it does change a component of your immune response. And are the masses of people globally aware of that? These are questions for us to consider. From a legal perspective, what happens if an employee experiences any adverse reactions? Will the manufacturer of the vaccine be liable? Or if the manufacturer cannot be held liable, will the employer be held liable? The reason why is because if the employer is introducing a mandatory workplace vaccine policy and something happens to the employee, can the family institute legal action against the manufacturer, or must the family sue the employer because it was upon the employer's request that the vaccine be taken in order to carry out employment? These are some of the burning questions. Let's take a look at what the law says now. There are 3 main grounds which are relied upon for mandatory vaccinations. And the first main ground are the regulations which were issued under the state of disaster declared in March 2020. These were used to regulate South Africa's COVID-19 response. Under these regulations, a person can be forced to undergo COVID-19 testing, and if they are infected, they must be isolated. Essentially, then, this is a form of compulsory isolation and quarantine. It does restrict a person's rights immensely. The second basis for introducing mandatory workplace vaccinations are the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which requires employers to provide a working environment that is safe and without a health risk. The third basis that companies rely on is, or rather, the directives which were issued by the Department of Labor. Essentially, these directives support the introduction of mandatory workplace vaccines, especially for employees who are at high risk for contracting COVID-19. The main legal critic and the main defense the introducing mandatory vaccines are people's constitutional rights. Some of these rights include the right to bodily integrity, freedom of religion, and of course, dignity. However, as we are all aware, no right in the Constitution is absolute. In other words, the response to the constitutional rights to bodily integrity, religion, is Section 36 of our Constitution, which states that no right is absolute and can be limited, which means that it cannot be enforced. So where does that leave us? Fortunately, we have some court decisions which we can use to guide us in interpreting the above. Let's look at a High Court decision in Pretoria, which found that the closing of mosques as part of lockdown measures was a justifiable limitation on the right to freedom of religion. The argument was that the measure would assist in controlling the pandemic, and the court specifically recognized the concept of Ubuntu, which meant that calling on citizens to make sacrifices to their individual rights for the greater good of curbing the pandemic. The second major case that we have is that of the Supreme Court of Appeal, which recognized the trade-off between individual liberties and curbing the spread of COVID-19. This was a judgment that found the regulations of the state of disaster to be largely constitutional. The ruling essentially stated that limiting individual liberties, such as the right to freedom of movement and the right to dignity, was justified because it protected the right to life, especially people who were vulnerable to those who were dying from COVID-19. Now, with those judgments in mind, how does this affect labor law? Can we use those judgments to come to a deduction, or do we have other resources available? Fortunately, we do. There is a recent CCMA case by the name of Mulderich versus Gold Rush, and this case confirmed that a person can be dismissed from work for not being vaccinated. The ground that was relied upon was incapacity. The employer's evidence was that the company had taken all procedural steps. They had set up a committee, they had put in place a policy, they had even provided for exemptions to those who were forced to be vaccinated. But the employee in question, the employee that was fired, that employee did not qualify for an exemption. And the employer also went to the CCMA and indicated that it could not accommodate the employee in any other position. And that is the gist of an incapacity dismissal. So in labor law, we have only three types of dismissal. We have a misconduct dismissal, where someone is dismissed from work for doing something wrong. We have a retrenchment, which is a no-fault dismissal, but a dismissal based on the operational requirements of a company, for example, financial, structural, or technological, the company cannot afford to keep that person anymore. And the third is incapacity. Incapacity goes to the person's ability to perform the functions. So essentially, this person was dismissed for incapacity. Now, one of the major factors for incapacity is also whether the employer could reasonably accommodate the employee in another position. And if that was not possible and dismissal was the only option, then dismissal amongst other factors would be seen to be fair. The employee in this case, this CCMA case, argued on her right to bodily integrity and on her personal fears that she had about the safety of the vaccine. The commissioner, after hearing both sides, had made a ruling that the effect of not being vaccinated at work actually made the employee permanently incapacitated. Let me say that again. The commissioner at the CCMA said, the fact that you are not vaccinated makes you permanently incapacitated. And that is an interpretation of the rulings on incapacity. The commissioner went further to state that the fact that the employee refused to be vaccinated meant that she was not willing to be part of a safe working environment, and that she was a high-risk individual as she had communicated and interacted with her colleagues on a daily basis. The commissioner relied on a memo that was written by Judge Roland Sutherland, DJP of Gauteng Division of the High Court, which emphasized that being vaccinated was actually a civic duty and that the interests of the community must trump personal preferences. To listeners and viewers today, I have a few questions for you to consider. If you were a commissioner in this case, would the situation have been different if the applicant in this case had already received COVID-19 and recovered from the virus, and thereby have positive antibodies? Would the situation be different? Would the company's argument of incapacity still hold water? Furthermore, what if the employee was working from home? Would the risk be minimal in that situation? Would she still be incapacitated from work? These are questions that need to be considered. And I think a lot of reliance on this case, especially in the media, where it's been published that if a person is not vaccinated, they can be dismissed. I don't know if that's an accurate statement, because every case is different. And as I've indicated, what if the person's working from home? What if they've got antibodies? What if they cannot take the vaccine because of medical reasons? They have an allergic response to one of the ingredients. Would that still be unfair? Take a look at another CCMA case. And this is a decision in Koch versus Indaka Security. In this case, the employee was required to submit a weekly COVID-19 test result. As a client of theirs, SASOG wanted a 100% vaccination rate or be refused access to their site. The employee was suspended from work, which he claimed to be an unfair labor practice. Now, this is an important aspect to highlight because the first case involved an unfair dismissal. This case deals with an unfair labor practice. The difference being an unfair dismissal is where a person is fired from work. An unfair labor practice involves where the person is still working, however, they are treated unfairly. In this case, he was suspended. He wasn't fired yet. Also, what's interesting to note is that the employer had accommodated other employees in the workplace 2 were required to submit weekly negative tests, and 1 worked in an isolated office. Yet, this particular employee was suspended from work. At the CCMA, the employee argued that it was his religious beliefs as a Christian that had prevented him from taking the vaccine. The commissioner found that the vaccine had shown a demonstrable success, in the words of the commissioner, in limiting serious illness, and that the employee was not able to show evidence to the contrary. That the purpose of the mandatory vaccination was clear: to create a safe working environment. There were also less restrictive measures in place, like face masks and social distancing, etc. And the commissioner also found that the reliance on religion was baseless and without theological support. Further, that the employee was in daily contact with people. Ultimately, the CCMA found that the suspension was fair. In other words, what the employer had done was a fair labor practice. Is there a way forward? Employers are the driving force behind mandatory vaccinations. They seem to be driving the push at the moment towards employees being vaccinated more than the government in South Africa. And if you had to contrast this to international policy, which we covered in the beginning, there appears to be more questions at this point than answers. Main aspect to consider is, what about exemptions? Every policy, mandatory policy, should have a form of exemption. An exemption would allow for certain employees not to be vaccinated. Currently, the exemptions that I've been seeing on my desk are constitutional and medical. Those are the 2 main grounds. What about religious grounds? Also, what about natural immunity? And if there's one thing to take away, I think this is the strongest aspect to consider. If a person who's had COVID already and recovered from the illness, and they've received a natural immunized response in their system, why should that person be forced to take the vaccine also? I'm not pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. I'm just someone who wants people to know their rights and know what options are available to them. I personally believe that companies should create this as an exemption to say that if a person has had COVID within a period of time and they can come forward with a positive COVID test result and a positive antibody result after they've been healed, to then compel that person to take the vaccine might be unfair towards that particular person. At the moment, I haven't seen any policies that cover natural immunity. However, as it stands right now, to answer your question, you can be fired from work if you are not vaccinated. That's what the law states. And we've got the CCMA decision to confirm that. However, as we are aware, all decisions can be challenged. Ultimately, we might only get our guidance from the highest court in the land, our constitutional court. If there are any questions, feel free to ask them, and I thank you for participating in today's presentation.